Okay. Let's see here. All right. Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for tonight's presentation. I'm Sarah Gorecki, and I'm the Chief Publishing Officer at the Colorado Mountain Club. This evening, we have CMC Press authors Bob Rosebrough and Matt Payne, who will show slides from their new book, Climbing Colorado San Juans. This new book is the most up-to-date and comprehensive climbing resource available for the San Juans range. It covers more than 300 peaks across 14 mountain subgroups. And tonight, Bob and Matt are going to share beautiful photos from the book, tell us about some of their favorite climbs, and share some climbing history of the area. Their book will be 20% off tonight during tonight's presentation on our website, cmcpress.org, which I'll put in the chat. And anyone who buys a copy of the book during tonight's event will be entered into a drawing to win a free CMC neck gaiter. Looks like this, pretty cool colors. And I'll announce the winner at the end of the event. So now for some quick Zoom etiquette. I'm sure you're all quite familiar with using Zoom by now, but here are a few friendly reminders. First, please keep your microphone muted. Secondly, please keep your cameras off. This really helps with internet bandwidth during the event. And tonight's session is being recorded, and it'll be up on our YouTube channel in a few days. And please do ask all of your questions in the chat box. We'll take some questions as we go, and then there will be a Q&A at the end. And now to introduce tonight's speakers. Bob Rosebrough is an avid mountaineer, lawyer, and an author. He lives in Gallup, New Mexico, and he has been climbing in the San Juans for over 50 years. Matt Payne is a photographer and mountaineer and the host of a photography podcast. He has climbed all of the 14ers and the highest 100 peaks in Colorado. And now over to you, Matt and Bob.
Okay, thank you, Sarah. I'll lead off. I'd like to just introduce myself to the group tonight. I grew up in Farmington, New Mexico, about 50 miles downstream from Durango. One of my earliest memories was as a first grader in Farmington. Every time I would lose a tooth, my mom would get the tooth and she would put it in a plastic or in a little Ziploc bag. And I would be told to take it to school to turn in that tooth. I did it a couple of times, and then I finally asked my mom, why am I doing this? Why am I taking my teeth to school? And she told me, well, there's a uranium mill up in Durango in which some of the tailings are going into the Animas River. And we're trying to see if you're getting any radiation from the uranium mill up in Durango. So anyway, that was one of my first connections to Southwest Colorado, and I have enjoyed my connection to Southwest Colorado my entire life. My two sisters and I and our parents had a cabin up in Vallecito, and we've just enjoyed coming up and roaming the San Juans. My first climb in the San Juans was kind of a spur of the moment affair. One of my buddies from the basketball team and I, we were both about 15 years old, decided that we wanted to go climb something in the La Platas, which we kind of from Farmington saw all the time. And we drove up the La Plata Canyon Road, parked our Ford Maverick on the La Plata Canyon Road and took a side canyon and ended up climbing a peak. I remember I was in Levi's and Converse high-top tennis shoes. And we made it to the top of the peak. We didn't know the name of the peak. I learned later it was Burwell, which was not a 13er. It was a 12,000 foot plus peak. But it was my introduction to climbing mountains and peaks. And needless to say, I got quickly hooked. One other significant factor of my climbing history was my father. And my father, Haskell, my early memories of my father were of him being overweight and sitting on a recliner watching TV all the time, smoking a pipe. But at about the time he turned 40, he got off the couch, got off the recliner, put away the pipe, and he started climbing mountains and backpacking in the San Juans. And it was, he helped introduce me to the San Juans, and we really had some good trips. And I really owe a debt of gratitude to my dad for that early life experience. One other comment I want to make before I turn this over to Matt, or actually kind of explain how Matt and I became connected on this. As at the age of 33, I wrote the first edition of the San Juan Guide, and I had the pleasure of then working with Walt Bornemann, who had written, along with Lynn Lambert, had written a climbing guide to the 14ers a few years prior to that. And working with Walt on that first edition, I was 33 years old at the time. I'm now 68. And it was, working with Walt was just one of the most enjoyable professional experiences I've had in my life. So a few years ago, the Colorado Mountain Club approached me about doing a new edition of the guide. And I was very eager to do that. But I also just thought that the guide could really use some help and could be better with a co-author. Although I was and still am actively climbing and enjoying that, I think there were some deficits and gaps in the guide that needed filling, including photography. I spent some time looking on the internet, calling around, talking, and I kept being drawn back to a website called 100 Summits. That is Matt's product, and it's Matt has. I was just drawn to his fantastic trip descriptions, and then the photography. Matt's photography speaks for itself. There are not enough accolades I can give it to do it justice or to describe it. I will say one final thing. I promise this is it before I turn it over to Matt. And that is working with Matt, has opened my eyes on something. And that, as a mountaineer, I've been always enjoyed alpine starts and getting, starting out with a headlamp before sunlight and before the dawn, and watching the sun come up as we're in the process of climbing a mountain. And I learned that photographers take that to another level. A lot of the photography you're going to see, that you'll see in the book that Matt has done, is photography that he doesn't want to see the sun rise as he's climbing a peak. He wants to be on the summit of the peak, getting set up about 45 minutes or an hour before the sun rises. So carrying a heavy load through the dark. But anyway, with that, it's been a pleasure to do a new edition of this guide and to be associated and have a partner like Matt for the guide. So Matt, over to you.
Oh, thanks, Bob. It's been a really fun project to work on, and it's funny. I have the first edition of the book. I used to reference it all the time when I was first getting into the San Juans, and what I particularly admired about the first edition of the book was the rich history that was contained within it, because I like to weave that into my trip reports, and I feel like having that knowledge of the history makes your connection to the mountains that much more profound. So I really appreciated that aspect of the book, and we've preserved that with this edition as well. So I'm Matt Payne. I'm a fifth generation Coloradan. I'm originally from Colorado Springs, and now I live in Durango, Colorado. And I like Bob, I got introduced to the mountains through my parents. My dad was actually really interested in climbing the highest 100 mountains in Colorado back before that was even like a thing. In fact, he was working on it at about the same time that Spencer Swanger was working on it. I don't think they just didn't know that. And so he was going into a lot of mountains that a lot of people hadn't been up before. Maybe, like Mike Garat and Bob Martin had been up them before, but not a lot of other people. And so anyway, they would take me on trips into the mountains as well. And I just got hooked, and I especially got hooked through maps. For whatever reason, you've got I was 5 years old when I climbed my first 14er. And to keep me occupied on the car rides in, they would hand me the topo map and they would tell me to figure out where things were on the map. And what's that? What's that? And that, for whatever reason, really stuck with me. And ever since then, every time I go on climbs, as I'm climbing, I'm like, oh, there's that and there's that. So I'm super obsessed with maps and the mountains. So, and then that obsession kind of transitioned as I got more and more into photography. Through this pursuit of climbing the highest 100 mountains in Colorado, and yeah, I love capturing the beauty of the Colorado mountains through the camera, and collaborating with Bob on this new edition of the book has been really, it's just been a labor of love. So and we've gotten along really well. So without further ado, let's go ahead and unveil the curtain on kind of what's in the book here. So a little bit about the book. You can see the original first edition book there on the left, which, if you've climbed only maybe like 1 or 2 14ers and you're looking at getting into the most rugged, amazing terrain there is, which is the San Juans, and you see that cover, it's like pretty intimidating, but also really exciting. You've got Pigeon Peak there in the background. Every time I tell people about the cover of that book, they're like, oh, I know that book. I have that book, because it's just such an iconic view, like, oh, and they're wearing shorts and tennis shoes, right? I'm like, yeah, that's the cover of that book. Exactly. And then we have the new edition of the book here, which is CMC Press has been really great to work with. They've been fantastic at designing and helping us edit it, and they've just been an amazing partner. But the book is a pretty substantial update from the original book. The original book had 145 peak descriptions in the book, and the new book has 321 peaks represented. There's 225 photographs from 14 mountain subgroups. I can show you one cool thing I like about the book is that on like the 3rd page, there's a map, and that map is color coded based on where in the San Juans you are, and the spine of the book shows the different color coding, so you can skip right to the section of the San Juans that you're interested in climbing. So that's super cool. We have 27 maps in the book, and as I had mentioned before, there's some really awesome history that Bob has included in the book, and of course we've included some information on gear and safety and leave no trace, and a project that I've been involved in called Nature First Photography, which is kind of like leave no trace for photographers. And of course, we've got some really great photographs in the book as well. And I'd be remiss not to say that we did get some help on some of the photos from my friend Mason Cummings, who's the photographer for the Wilderness Society, and my friend Kiefer Thomas as well, who's a fantastic mountaineer here in Colorado. And then we did get some help with some of the route descriptions from climb13ers.com from Tim and Carrie Cooney. So yeah, it's been a really fun project. And without further ado, I want to turn it back over to Bob, who's gonna share like a nice excerpt from Lizard for us.
Okay. Thanks, Matt. So this is not an excerpt from our guide, but this is an excerpt from an article I wrote for Rock and Ice magazine back a while ago, back in 1988, 2 years after the first edition of the guide came out. Before one thing, as a preface, I should say I should introduce you to my 2 climbing partners from that era. And climbing partners were Ernie and Ike. Ernie Strohmeyer, who was a dentist, a devout Seventh-day Adventist who did not drink and was a vegetarian and one of the most pleasant, mild-mannered people on the face of the earth. And our other partner, Ike Weaver, was Ernie's shadow. He was a completely different from Ernie in every way possible. But this is a portion of an article I wrote about describing our experience on Lizard Head. It's early June and there's still a ton of snow. I've been thinking about this monster all winter. There are dozens of stories about Lizard Head, all bad. Rockfall, climbing falls, turned ankles, and jammed rappel ropes seem to be a matter of course. As I slot a number 4 friend above the bulge on the second pitch, it blows me away to know that Albert Ellingwood led this with a hemp rope, 3 railroad spikes, and hobnailed boots. The crux is hard, 5'7", maybe even 5'8" on loose rock. For him to lead it, essentially unprotected, is nothing short of amazing. Once off, we're relieved that we have not added to the route's litany of horrors. Before going home, we stop in Rico for a drink. The bar is operated and frequented by a bunch of long-haired 60s throwbacks. Ike had a run-in with them several weeks ago over use of their phone. As we go in, they eye Ike warily, but strike up a conversation nevertheless. It soon comes out that we've just climbed Lizard Head. The bartender is impressed. "Some guys have died up there, haven't they?" he asks. "Yeah," Ike says in a slow, deliberate drawl as he looks around the dingy bar. "Looks like a few guys have died in here too." So that gives you a flavor of my climbing partner, Ike. The photo on the screen is the crux on Lizard Head. This is the second pitch of Lizard Head. That's me climbing. I'm slotting a number 4 friend into a fist-sized crack there, and there's a little bit of a bulge, and it's the crux where you have to come out and go over that bulge in order to get to the summit. I would kind of a companion to Lizard Head, and from my perspective, is Chimney Rock. I'd like to do just a short reading about a climb that we from the same article that we did on Chimney Rock. Ernie is 2 weeks. Ernie is 2 weeks shy of 40. He's in excellent shape and reed thin, so you'd never guess his age. He jokes as we sort gear after dinner. "Are you still going to climb with me after I turn 40, Bob?" "Sure," I answer. "I'm just going to make you do more leading." Ernie looks puzzled. He doesn't respond. "You've already lived a nice full life," I add. "Maybe we should come back in a couple of weeks when I can make good on the threat." Chimney Rock is one that I'm worried about. I can't really pinpoint why, but I just don't feel good about it. An abortive approach, which ends in a double rope free rappel, doesn't ease my concern, nor when we finally reach the base does the lick of the first pitch. The slightly overhanging start looks awkward, hard, unprotectable. Part of my concern vanishes the moment I start. This isn't hard. The holds are almost magical. Pebbles, fist-sized rocks, even small boulders are welded into place. These holes are unbelievable, but are they solid? I hope so. If they start popping, it could be messy. On the second pitch, I set a cramped belay on top of the huge chalkstone Bob Orms talked about. On the first ascent, Orms and Mel Griffiths climbed up different sides. There was one problem. The rope between them was still draped under the chalkstone. quote, must have been excited, close quote, Orm said. I can see why. Above us, the hold follows a near vertical wall with hundreds of holds. Great climbing, high exposure, but one nagging problem, very little protection. I've been spoiled. I'm used to slotting a friend or banging in a piton every 10 feet. My pitons dangle usefully on the rack the entire climb. My first clean climb of a San Juan pinnacle. I certainly hope it's the last. With that, I think it'd be a good time, Matt, to shift to maybe talking about some of our respective favorite climbs in the San Juans. Would you be willing to kind of lead off and share your thoughts on your favorite climbs?
Yeah, I mean, for me, at the top of the list is probably Vestal and Arrow, here pictured left and right. There's just something incredibly magical about those two mountains. I think, you know, the approach from pretty much anywhere is challenging. I think most people, in the way that I approach them, is by getting a ride from the train and then getting dropped off at Elk Park and then backpacking up into Vestal Basin, which in its own right is a pretty stiff adventure. But you know, once you get to the base of Vestal, you know, it looks super intimidating, but it's that quartzite that just, it's super solid, and there's probably not much of a better view in the San Juans, except from the side of Arrow Peak on the right, looking across over at Vestal. And this is a photograph that I captured from the summit of Arrow Peak at sunset, which, if you were to say that I was a little out of my mind to stay on the top of Arrow Peak till sunset, you were probably correct, because it was definitely one of the hairiest down climbs in the dark that I've ever had to do with a camera. But it was definitely worth it. You know, you get an incredible view of the Needles and, you know, Jagged there at center, and then you have the Chicago Basin 14ers, and then you have Pigeon on the far right. And so I remember the next day we were down at Vestal Lake, and there was a group of Texans who had backpacked up in there to do some fly fishing, and they were like, "Oh, you were the guys up on Arrow after dark?" And they're like, "Yeah." And they're like, "Well, we were praying for you." So and that's you know, that's some of the wild things that I have to do in order to get some of these images. But another favorite of mine is Dallas Peak. This is a photo of Blue Lakes and Sneffels from near the top of Dallas Peak. What I like about Dallas Peak is that it's quite the adventure and quite the route finding, and it does introduce you to some pretty challenging rock climbing, but it's really safe and approachable. I think the hardest move is like 5.3, maybe 5.4, depending on which you choose. But there's lots of little areas that you have to kind of rope up for, and, you know, get up 10 feet, and then you kind of move on to the next little section. So I really enjoyed that mountain. But of course, the views of Blue Lakes from up there is just outstanding. I think another sleeper for me that a lot of people don't climb is unnamed 13,300, which is over by Twin Sisters. Just, I guess you would say it's kind of west of Twin Sisters. It's in between Rolling Mountain and the Ice Lake Basin 13ers. And this is a view of the summit looking north at Fuller and all the Ice Lake Basin 13ers. And so I really enjoyed that one. And it's relatively easy, like pretty much anyone can do that one. And then another kind of sleeper that I really enjoy, just because I'll never forget capturing this particular scene, is a little 13er over by Silverton called Tower Mountain. It's best approached via like a quick backpack or maybe a quick day hike from Velocity Basin, which is at the base of some fantastic peaks, and like another really awesome turquoise lake up there. But of course, the wildflowers up there, as paired with the incredible sunset, is pretty memorable. Another favorite of mine would be U.S. Grant, mostly because you have these amazing views of the Ice Lake Basin and Ice Lakes, and then Island Lake down there. And then you can look across and you can see all the grenadiers and the needles. It's a fairly challenging climb. You approach it from Island Lake typically, and there's a little section that's like, I don't know, it's probably like 15 feet of class 4 exposed climbing that you have to get up. But once you're up there, it's incredible. And you get views like this. So that's very memorable. Another favorite of mine is another really easy mountain to climb. This is Whitehead Peak. It's over by Silverton above Highland Mary Lakes. And the reason I like it is because you get these views of Vestal and Arrow and Pigeon and the Three Trinities basically for like an hour and a half of climbing. So, who doesn't like that? It's as soon as the Grenadiers poke out, you're just like, this is amazing. So I love that one. And then I'm gonna turn it back over to you, Bob. This is a photo of Ruby Basin, and I think you'll recognize the index over there.
Oh, right. Yeah. The index is probably the hardest climb that I ever did in the San Juans. Oh gosh, it took, I think 3 separate trips for us to summit. On the first trip, we got rained in and basically spent a weekend in a tent and made little progress. The second trip we made, the circuitous route on the index is just, there's no way to really describe it on paper or in a photo. It's an incredibly difficult route to find and to establish. And then the final crux on the index is a vertical crack that is larger than a fist. So you can't really do a fist jam to climb it. So the only way that I got to the top of the index was for Ernie. Ernie and I had another, and I had another climbing buddy named Hal who would come with us frequently. And he was like a middle linebacker on a football team. And Hal gave me a shoulder stand. And that is the only way that I would have made it to the top of the index. But I'd like to go to a complete opposite in terms of 2 peaks some peaks that stand out to me as favorite climbs. One of my very best days in the mountains was kind of at the end of a week in which I was climbing in the Needles, started with Pigeon and worked my way over to the Grenadiers and climbed a bunch of peaks in between and climbed the Trinities, Arrow, and Vestal. But I wanted to finish off all of the Grenadiers, including Point Pun and Garfield. But on that day, I climbed some peaks, and I didn't think I was going to have time to get to Point Pun and to Garfield. And I was climbing solo, and it was kind of a magical end to a week in the Needles. And those are just low 13ers, Garfield and Point Pun. But I just felt like I had the entire range to myself on those 13ers. The sun was setting, and I was able to set up just a solo camp high up in a basin, about 13 after summiting him and getting back in time to set the camp. And it's just a day I'll never forget. Another one in terms of my favorites is Ernie and Ike and I made a climb on a peak that doesn't have a name, and I can't give you the elevation of it, but it was north of Eolus and east of Monitor. And we climbed it in a misty rain where our vision was obscured. We had visibility of about maybe 50 or 75 feet throughout the day. And we were on a ridge, and it was just a perfect granite ridge that was rounded on both sides. And we just followed that ridge up into the mist and got to the summit, and we couldn't see a thing from the summit. But again, it was just a magical day, and it was a magical climb. And to be honest with you, I don't even know that it was the summit. I think it was, but the view was so obscured, there may have been a higher point, on a different ridge. But anyway, that doesn't diminish how I feel about the day. It was just it was a wonderful day. I think I'll talk about one other thing, and that's probably the most miserable that day that I've spent in the San Juans, and that was an attempt at a winter climb on El Diente. We skied in from Dutton and set a camp high on the Kilpacker side of El Diente, and it was in a storm with high winds, and we decided we were going to try to do the climb anyway. And we got up onto the west ridge of El Diente from the Kilpacker side, which was difficult. And I was with Ike and with another friend, Craig Perlott, and I don't know how close we got to the summit, but we didn't make the summit. Wisely, we turned back. Craig was having some problems. He was having some difficulties, and it's one of the very best decisions I ever made in my life, was to not push for the summit, and with one of my climbing companions having some difficulty. So we made it down, and we made it down alive, skied into Dutton well after dark, and we're glad to be safe, and everyone was healthy. So that was a very different day, but memorable as well, and in the end, one that sticks in my memory. Matt, where should we go from here? Do we?
I've got two more stories I'd like to tell real quick. Two of my most memorable days in the San Juans as a photographer. The first one is this particular image that's on the screen right now is I photographed this from the summit of North Aeolus, not far from where you were at, Bob, in your story. But I had, I'm one of those people that likes to do things the hard way for whatever reason. I don't know, but instead of taking the train in to Chicago Basin, I actually started at Enzlick Mesa and did a bunch of 13ers on my way in. I think my pack weighed 65 pounds for that trip, and it was a five-day trip. And anyway, on our third day, we got into Chicago Basin, and the next morning, we got up at about 2:30, 3 o'clock, and I mean, this was before Gaia GPS and cell phones that had maps on them, but I had a GPS unit, a Magellan that had the USGS topo maps, and I could see where I was at on the map. So I was using that to make sure I stayed on route. But we got to close to the top of North Aeolus, and there was this family of mountain goats, little baby mountain goats up there that were, if you've never heard a baby mountain goat calling for its mom, it's a pretty spectacular sound that I don't think I can emulate here tonight. But anyway, we got to the top of North Aeolus right before sunrise, and it was one of those rare moments. In photography, we like to call this gap light, where you have low clouds and you have the sun just poking through on the horizon, and it can create these magical moments of light on the mountains and then also in the clouds. So that was a pretty special day that ended up with us also going over and getting Aeolus, and then we had to bail because of weather. We ended up climbing Windham and Sunlight though, so that worked out the next day. And then my other favorite moment, which is actually the story of the cover photo for the book. This is a photograph that I captured on the summit of Turret Peak at sunrise. And that was a particularly memorable adventure because I literally did not sleep for like 36 hours straight. I had taken the train in on a Friday morning, backpacked up to Ruby Basin, set up camp, but it was so beautiful that I was just so excited I couldn't sleep. And one of my main goals was to photograph the Perseid meteor shower from the saddle between Pigeon and Turret. And so at 10 o'clock at night, I climbed up to the saddle, set up my tripod and my camera. I photographed the meteor shower for like 3 hours. And then I didn't have super warm clothes. So I was just like huddled next to my tripod, shivering, which wasn't great. And then I was like, well, I guess I'll go climb Turret before sunrise. And then I climbed over to Turret in the dark. And then I got to witness this magical sunrise, which was obviously one of the most spectacular moments I've ever had in the mountains. I mean, you have the sun rising behind Jagged Mountain and Rio Grande Pyramid over there, and you've got, Animus Mountain and Monitor and Peak 13, and then you've got Vestal and Arrow back there in the Three Trinities. I mean, it was just, you can actually see Wetterhorn and Uncompahgre way back there too, which is pretty cool. But yeah, that was a special day. The bad thing was that I really wanted to climb Pigeon as well, but I had not slept yet. So I decided, you know what, I'm just going to go for it. And if you've never done Pigeon from there, what you have to do is you have to go back to the saddle, and then you have to drop down the southwest face of Pigeon about 1,000 feet. And then you have to regain Pigeon, which was really, really hard with no sleep, but managed to pull that off, got back down, and took a nice long nap. Then Bob, you've got this really cool photo that we included in the book of this piton that I believe has a story behind it as well.
It does, yeah. I'd like to talk about that. So this takes me back again to the phase of when I was climbing all the San Juan spires, Lizard Head and Chimney Rock and Little Finger and those. But anyway, Ernie and Ike again we were climbing Wolf's Tooth, which is a pinnacle down on the western flank of Mount Sneffels, and on the Blue Lakes basin side of Sneffels. And we were, the route there's a chimney route. It's a long one pitch route, takes almost the entire full length rope to climb the chimney. Down low in the chimney, I was climbing, and I saw this piton, and it was in the route that was climbed by the San Juan mountaineers, Dwight Lavender, Mel Griffiths, Gordon Williams, and rather than putting in a protection, I just clipped into this with a carabiner, clipped into the piton. And I made a move or two, and the piton just came loose and fell onto the rope, and I just climbed with it, dangling, and set my other protection. And anyway, we climbed the chimney, got down, and that was on a Saturday, and we had another peak. We were planning to make another climb the next day, which was Lavender Peak in the La Platas. And we got on the summit of Lavender, and I had forgotten about the piton, but I remember I was wearing some corduroy knickers, and I was reaching for something in my pocket, and that grasped this piton. And so there on the summit of Lavender, I just drove the piton into the summit, took this photo, and then pulled it out. And so this piton that's in this photo was forged by Dwight Lavender in the Stanford University laboratory sometime in the early 1930s. Dwight Lavender is of all the historical figures in the San Juans, is the most intriguing figure in my experience, or in my opinion. He tragically died of polio, and Lavender is in the, but anyway, he died of polio at the age of 23. Prior to the time that he passed away, he co-authored the San Juan Mountaineers climbing guide to the San Juans. And he made, I believe, close to 50 first ascents prior to his death at the age of 23. Just a remarkable person. But anyway, his piton that serendipitously fell onto my rope on the wolf's tooth, I took with me to Lavender the next day, and photographed it on the top, and then hid it in a place on Lavender where it will not be found. So it's his piton has found its home up there. Should we probably time to open this up for some questions?
Yeah.
All right, thanks for all those fun stories. Matt, I have a question. Tell us a little bit about how you got into photography.
Yeah, no, it's a good question. Because my dad was so into climbing mountains, when I got back into climbing mountains in my early 30s, we would go on walks together, and because we worked really close together, like a couple blocks away from each other. So every lunch we would walk together to get some exercise. And I would always ask him, like, for my next mountain coming up, I'm like, so what's this one like? What's that one like? And of course he's like, well, he doesn't have any photos, and he doesn't have anything written down that he could send to me. And so that was kind of what inspired me to create my website, 100summits.com, and to take photos. So the camera was really just, early on, it was just meant as a documentation device to document kind of what I was doing so I could share it on my website. And then that was back in like 2007. And then fast forward to 2011, I got really, really hooked on it and decided to buy a more higher end DSLR. And I basically went to the library and checked out every book I could find on photography, and then did a ton of experimentation. And then with that new knowledge, I would take my camera with me on my hikes. And then it was really dangerous, because then it was like, do I want to take a picture, or do I want to get to the top of the mountain? And sometimes those two goals aren't always matching up, especially if there's an interesting photograph to take and the weather's looking a little iffy. So anyway, that's I got into photography because of mountain climbing. Yeah, that was a long-winded way of answering that question.
Great. If anybody has any questions for Matt or Bob, please put them in the chat, and they'd be happy to answer any questions. In the meantime, do you two have any tips for important gear, safety, leave no trace, any kind of other like logistical kind of climbing advice that you might have?
I mean, we could spend like 4 hours talking about that, but one of the best investments I made was another book called Freedom from the Hills, which teaches you a lot about knots and anchors, and but more importantly, something that saved my life twice now is knowing how to use your ice axe. I actually was climbing Gladstone and Wilson Peak a few years ago, And on our way back, on our way down from Wilson Peak, we were camped down in Bilk Basin, and we decided to go down this snowshoot and glissade it. And for whatever reason, I went second, and the path I took was way icy, and I was going like a million miles an hour, and I was gonna crash into a bunch of rocks. And I fortunately I'd read that section on glissading and self-arrest like the day before our trip. And so very calmly, I rolled onto my stomach and planted my ice axe into the snow, and it saved my life. So I would say, reading that book is really helpful, and then practicing in a safe location. I know that Colorado Mountain Club, you guys do a lot of outings where you're teaching people those kinds of things. I would highly recommend those kinds of events. Other safety things, technology's come a long ways, but and I use technology a lot, but I think it's really important to learn some, map skills and orienting skills, even if you have Gaia GPS on your phone and you have a Garmin InReach or whatever. Those are like, you shouldn't use those as a crutch, even though I do love Gaia GPS whenever I'm in the field. I've got Gaia running on my phone, and I've got all the maps downloaded, and I'm constantly looking at maps, and I know where I'm at. But there's nothing that beats a good understanding how to use your compass and a map. So that's important. Yeah, and then leave no trace. We outline a lot of that in the book, but I think it's really important for people who are going out into these places to spend a lot of time understanding Leave No Trace. lnt.org. And that was instilled in me at an early age by my parents. I think it's important to know and understand the places you're visiting, and know what impacts we have on them as human beings, and understand the rules and try to follow them as best you can, including, where to camp, where not to camp, when to have a fire, when not to have a fire, all that kind of fun stuff. And obviously carry out all of your trash. It's a pet peeve of mine, but probably the second pet peeve of mine is understand that we as visitors in the wilderness, we have an impact not only on the wilderness, but also on other people who are trying to experience the wilderness. So, maybe don't turn on your Bluetooth speaker, those kind of things. That is a Leave No Trace rule as well. But those are my main ones. What about you, Bob?
I'd like to echo the ice axe, and I'd add helmet. I've had twice I've needed an ice axe and had it both occasions. One was doing a standing glissade on coming down from Mount Wilson and El Diente, and hit a patch and fell and was able to self-arrest, and also had a similar experience on South Lookout on a snow couloir on the eastern flank of South Lookout. And without an ice axe, it would have been bad. It would have been very bad. And a helmet. I like wearing a helmet, particularly when there's a lot of snow, or when it's a technical route, or the fact is that in the San Juans there's a lot of loose rock. The grenadiers are a rarity in terms of how solid the rock is there. Virtually every place else, you're going to be encountering rockfall from time to time. So yeah, that would be my addition.
I think to your point, Bob, there's a lot of accidents that occur from rockfall, and what I always talk to my climbing partners about is, first of all, communication is super important. So whenever you get to a location where there's a lot of loose rock, it's important to talk about what your plan is and to pay attention to each other. And there's really two strategies that work well depending on the terrain. But the first one is to try to stay really close to each other, so that if there is any rockfall, it's not going to hit somebody 20 feet below you. And if that's not possible, then it's important to just take turns descending, especially, so that any rock fall that might occur, isn't hitting the person below you. And then, what I like to do is, I'll maybe go down 20 feet and then I'll duck behind like around a corner, around a big rock or something. And then I'll be, okay, you're good. You can come down now. So I think that communication piece is really important.
Matt, we do have a question in the chat box that says, please tell us more about any maps included in the book. Could you describe?
Yeah, so I think we said there's 14 sub-ranges in the book. And then within each sub-range, there may be at least one, but often there's multiple maps. They're all generated using Gaia GPS, and then they all have any mountain that's referenced in the book is labeled on the map, on all the maps that are in the book. And then the maps also include logos that kind of include prominent trailheads or places where you would start a climb. But I think the maps are pretty cool. I'm a huge fan of maps, but they kind of look like that. Sorry, I don't have them on my monitor, but there's a lot of really good topo maps in there. And we purposely did not include like, here's an outline of how you get to the top, because both Bob and I believe that that is part of the adventure is, knowing how to get and trying to figure out your way to the top and learning the skills to do route finding and things like that. But I think the text that we provide and the maps and the photos, I think it gives you enough to where you can figure it out.
I'd also added that if we did route descriptions for each peak in map format, or in a map format, the book, instead of being 300 pages, would be 1,300 pages. It's just right. There's not a room, not physically possible to do that with all of these.
Exactly.
Very true. Are there any additional questions from the participants? Anyone have any last questions? Well, tonight's winner of the CMC Neck Gator is William Sturgeon. So I will put this in the mail to you. And thank you all so much for coming. Matt and Bob, do you have any parting words or stories that you want to share with us?
My parting words are just the mountains are fantastic. The San Juans are fantastic. Ultimately, it's one of the most rewarding things is just the personal relationships you make through mountaineering, and the friends you make, and the climbing partners you associate with. And it's a wonderful life. It's a wonderful activity and I am pleased again to say that my dad got off the lounger and introduced me to it all.
I think the one thing I would add is what's wonderful about the San Juans and about our book is that there's really something in there for anyone. You don't need to be a world-class rock climbing god legend like Bob is. You can be an average, okay hiker and still find yourself on some amazing adventures like me in the San Juan. So there's really something for everyone there, including families and children. I just took my son actually 2 weekends ago up a couple of really easy 13ers by Lake City. So there's something in here for anyone.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much, Bob and Matt, for sharing your process of writing the book and all the stories about climbing and climbing history. And we appreciate you doing this talk. Thanks everyone for attending, and we'll see you out on the trails. See you in the mountains.
Thank you.
Have a good night.